After several politicians propose nationwide rent control, one author says we are looking at the wrong solution to the problem. We need more housing and less rent control. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over one of those topics that I keep covering because it's important, okay? It's really important now, especially because politicians are talking about nationwide rent control proposals, okay? They want rents capped throughout the entire country. It doesn't matter if you're in a state like mine, which is much more landlord friendly, or if you're in a place like California. If the federal government comes in there and says, hey, we're going to cap rents, well, we're all going to suffer. Okay, so I'm going to fight against this sort of thing. I'm going to be bringing you articles and, different viewpoints of this whole situation. So the author of this article, they're saying that, hey, you know what? We don't need more rent control. Rent control actually is going to have the opposite effect of what they think it's going to do. It's not going to make housing more affordable. It's going to make housing less affordable. It's because it's going to limit our supply. We need greater supply if we want to bring prices down. Okay, when they talk about a place like California, San Francisco in particular, where they have rent control policies in place, well, if you look at the restrictions they have on building that make it very difficult to build, they say on average, it takes 87 permits, it takes over 1,000 days of meetings, and it costs over $500,000 in fees for each project that's being proposed. Okay, so, that's a huge burden on every single developer who wants to build new properties within the city, and that's why you see so little development. On top of that, they have such restrictive, rent control laws. They have such restrictive anti-landlord laws that a lot of people just don't want to operate in that area, even if there is money to be made. Now, with the current turn in the economy, guess what? Rent prices within San Francisco are dropping at one of the fastest rates across the entire country, because they're working from home more now. So a lot of landlords, they're eating it, okay? They are eating losses, and it is very, very, very bad for them. So, the solution to a lot of these problems with affordable housing, etc., is we need more housing. And the states, the local municipalities, etc., are the ones who are causing the shortage of housing by throwing these sort of proposals out there. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like, subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. So what do you think some of the biggest impediments are to states and local municipalities when it comes to developing new housing? Now, obviously, a place like San Francisco, there isn't a lot of land to build. Okay, there is, pretty much 100% developed within the city limits, and places like New York, etc., right? Those places are already built to capacity. But there is the issue of property owners who want to tear down a building, like maybe a building with a lower number of floors, and build taller buildings, and they can't do that because the neighbors, they will tie those sort of projects up forever. How much rights do you believe that the neighbors or the neighborhood may have to restrict what a property owner does with their property? This is a topic to me that is quite interesting because, I know I live in a subdivision, and I wouldn't like it very much if somebody proposed tearing down my next door neighbor's house and building an apartment complex in its place, because obviously it's a single family neighborhood. But that's part of the reason also I moved into a neighborhood with an HOA, so that at least we would have that extra level of protection to prevent that sort of thing from happening. But, how far should the property owners be able to go with their own properties? That's the real question. And, at what point are we infringing upon the other property owners' rights, who are the neighbors? It's a complicated topic. It's not black and white. It's not hey, the property owner should be able to do whatever they want on their property. When we're talking about, it could, really, really hurt the other properties that are surrounding it. But anyway, let's get into the article and see what it says. This article is coming from CaliforniaGlobe.com, and it says, we need more housing, not rent control. Rent control achieves the opposite of its intent. Let's get into it. A progressive economist once said that rent control appears to be the most efficient technique presently known to destroy a city, except for bombing. But California is flirting with this policy wash-up nonetheless. An initiative that would sweep aside state laws limiting rent control recently cleared the signature hurdle to hit the ballot in 2024. California voters should reject the magical thinking behind rent control when actual solutions to our housing challenges exist. Rent control in the U.S. began as a wartime measure in the early 20th century, stuck around as urban growth exploded, then lost momentum in the 1980s as economists and the public saw its ill effects. But despite broad consensus that rent control is a false promise, it is enjoying an ominous revival. In July, a group of economists who take a minority view on rent control sent a letter to the Biden administration urging nationwide rent regulations, arguing that rent control helps marginalized communities and doesn't impact housing supply. A recent Supreme Court petition challenging New York City's rent stabilization law has also stirred up rent control defenders, with one housing policy analyst howling that a ruling against rent control would spell the end of New York City. You know, like a lot of the people who are arguing against rent control, right? The people who are arguing for rent control, they think that the second that, like, if they were to repeal rent control in New York, let's say that New York City instantly just all rent control within the city, all rent stabilization was just gone, okay? And landlords could raise their rents to whatever they wanted, right? And they'd be like, oh, well, all the landlords are going to double or triple their rents like that. Like, well, the problem is that landlords cannot raise the rent. And this is the truth, okay? The way that the free market works, landlords cannot raise their rent no matter what you think is going to happen. They cannot raise their rent more than people are willing to pay. Okay? You cannot raise your rent more than people are willing to pay. It's a simple fact. Okay? If people are only willing and able to pay $1,000 a month for your unit, then it doesn't matter if you say, well, rent is now $2,000 a month or rent is now $3,000 a month. That doesn't mean anything. When the free market dictates the rent, simply put, if you put $2,000 on there and people are only willing and able to pay $1,000, then that's all you're going to be able to get. Okay? People, I think that the rent control proponents, the people who like rent control, they forget this fact or they don't understand it. That landlords can only charge what people are willing and able to pay. That is it. Not a penny more. And, you know, we all know this as landlords, okay? I would love to say, you know, for my house where I'm only getting like $1,300 a month rent right now, I would love to say, yeah, you know, I'll put a tenant in there for $2,000 a month. I can't because nobody's willing to pay that much for it. So my house would sit empty and I would lose money every single month until I lowered my rent down to a level that people are willing and able to pay. That's what the truth is. So if all those people, if they think for any second that if rent control disappeared tomorrow, that suddenly all the rents in the city would double or triple, they're out of their minds because people are unwilling and unable to pay that much money. Maybe there would be some rent increase, but not like that. What would probably happen is that, you know, you would see rent increases up to levels that, you know, where people are still willing and able to pay it so that these landlords are able to cover their expenses a little bit better without losing money every single month. But let me continue. Perhaps rent control's devotees hope to capitalize on growing desperation, the favored prey of most bad ideas. After all, the homelessness rate is at an all-time high, rents are at an all-time high, and the ratio of renters to owners is at an all-time high. We could use some lows, but not the kind that are comparable to carpet bombing. Rent control achieves the opposite of its intent. A 2018 study of San Francisco's rent control regime, for example, showed that rent control reduced the supply of rental housing, reduced housing affordability, and reduced economic equality. Those are the wrong kind of lows. The reason for this counterintuitive result is simple. Rent control fails to account for rational human responses. Faced with an inability to receive a return on their labor and investments, or even being forced to rent property at a loss, housing providers faced with rent control often convert their property to condominiums, tenancies in common, or other uses outside the controlled market. Yeah, and this is something that I have brought up so many times. They think that if we implement rent control, well, the landlords, they're just going to sit there and take it. They're not going to do anything. They're just going to, oh, you know what? You're right. I'm just going to take that loss and lose money No, we're not dumb. Okay. Landlords are going to go out of business. They're going to sell their properties to owner occupants. They're going to convert them over to condominiums or co-ops. They're going to use the properties for other uses. And in the case of New York in particular, some landlords are just warehousing their units, just sitting and leaving them empty and not renting them out at all. And they're like, well, why is this happening? Why are the number of units decreasing? Because landlords cannot make a profit based upon the rents that they are allowed to charge. Okay? So they would rather go out of business or find other uses or, convert them for other uses than sit there and continue to lose money every month for an eternity. That's just the simple truth. So yeah, they completely misjudged the human response to, hey, this investment isn't making me any money. So I'm going to invest my money where I will make money. Rent control also discourages new construction. In 2021, St. Paul, Minnesota capped rent increases at 3%. 3 months later, permits for multifamily housing had plummeted by 82% in St. Paul and shot up 68% in Minneapolis. Rent control laws sometimes deal with this by exempting new construction, but then the rent-controlled housing pushes prices upward in the uncontrolled market. Yeah, and that's one of the things that you see very often, right? So anywhere where rent control is, they have exemptions to it. So you're saying, oh, new construction is exempted. Well, the prices will be pushed upward in those newer units because, simply put, some of the property owners are people who own rent-controlled units and units that are not under rent control, and they have to subsidize the lower, priced units with the higher priced units over here. So, like the developers, they often build all the new construction to be luxury. Yeah, I mean, there's some people who can make a profit off of rent control, but what I've seen is a lot of the profits that are made off of rent control is by figuring out ways to, deregulate it, to get it out of rent control so that you can bring it up to higher market rate rents. And when the market rate rents are applied, that increases the value of the property as a whole, and then the property owner is able to sell the property at a much higher price and make money. So, there's people who are really, really good at doing that sort of thing, but they keep trying to close the loophole. Oh, this isn't right that they are deregulating these rent-controlled units, and so they want to take away opportunities for property owners or landlords to do that, which the only thing that really does is it discourages more property owners from even wanting to deal with it. Why should they? They shouldn't, Instead, they're going to be like, hey, we're going to find other investment vehicles where we can spend our money. And that might be the stock market. That might be in commercial real estate, like office buildings, malls, industrial buildings, etc. Okay. But something that is not under rent control where I can invest and get a decent rate of return. The truth of the matter is that rent control destroys development. It makes it much harder for landlords and tenants. And people, they will see this, okay? They will see this, but the effects aren't immediate. They take a while to really get a good view of, okay? And fortunately, this article, they're talking about the real solution to the housing affordability issue being more development, okay? And let me just skip down a little bit because they throw out here that here's a couple of ways that they suggest that we get more development out there. There is a more reliable and straightforward way to lasso runaway rents. Address barriers to housing supply. Ironically, rent control is one such barrier. We need solutions that spur housing growth, not hold it back. Housing economist Jay Parsons has shown that recent cooling of rents has not happened smoothly across the country. Rent increases are lower where housing supply is booming. That's the right kind of low. There are many ways to cultivate housing growth, but to name just two: simplify permitting and open up shared living options. Okay, so basically, like there used to be a lot more of very, very low cost housing for people who have just super duper low incomes. Like, for example, there'd be like boarding houses, a lot more boarding houses throughout the entire country, where you may have a house with 4 bedrooms that all share just one single bathroom and kitchen, stuff like that, right? And it's not very common anymore due to zoning laws, due to a lot of, local regulations, but it would provide the sort of low income housing that is, just very, very crucial for the very bottom rungs of the ladder. The other thing is, in terms of building, a lot of cities make it extremely difficult to build anything. Very difficult and very, very costly. And in particular, you see this in a lot of the more progressive places. They make it darn near impossible. So if we can change zoning laws and permitting processes and permitting fees and all the hoops you have to jump through, if we could get rid of a lot of that garbage and make it easier to build, then we would see a lot more development, even in places that are basically built out like San Francisco and New York. But, that would take a very large change in the way that people, their attitudes towards development. Because right now, people, they have this whole thing of, hey, I don't want that in my backyard. I don't want an apartment complex built right there. I don't want a shade from the building blocking out my view of the sunlight. And it's hard to blame them because like I was saying earlier, I own my own house and, I don't want my view blocked off. I don't want, a lot of other stuff either, but we have to be able to have a good balance between property rights and the rights of the neighbors nearby without totally killing development.